Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. Like many people in my generation, I was rock obsessed when I was growing up. My wall was covered in posters of Zeppelin, Rush, Van Halen, The Smiths, Depeche Mode, and others. And I constantly fantasized about becoming a rock star. Obviously, that was not my path, yet I still wonder what it actually would have been like to become a rock star. And regarding this episode, what would it be like to become a rock star in a mega band and lose that status? Harder still, what would it be like to watch your rock star bandmates enjoy international fame at levels seen by very few bands, create platinum records, play halftime at the Super Bowl, and win a bunch of Grammys? I had the pleasure of sitting down with Maroon 5 founding drummer Ryan Dusick, who shared what that was like. Ryan was there from the early days, long before Maroon 5 was even a thing, back when they were known as Kara's Flowers. He grew up with Adam Levine and the other bandmates, and together they created what I consider one of the greatest albums of all time, Songs About Jane. Ryan was part of the band's enormous success, and as you will hear, anxiety, perfectionism, and other phenomena sidelined him, eventually taking him out of his coveted position as drummer. You'll hear what it was like to deal with the loss, the FOMO, the social comparison, struggles with addiction, and a kind of heartache few can imagine. But it doesn't end there. In this interview, you'll hear how he found and continues to find meaning afterwards. Today, Ryan is an associate marriage and family counselor, and I am confident he is and will continue to become a superb therapist. He wrote a phenomenal memoir I love so much that I listened to it twice. It's called Harder to Breathe, a memoir of making Maroon 5, losing it all, and finding recovery. So listen in as Ryan and I get into life before, during, and after Maroon 5. Ryan Dusick, a hearty welcome to Super Psyched.
Thank you so much. It's good to be on.
Right on. Well, I remember the very first time I ever heard, I'm sure you've heard this before, Maroon 5. And I was kind of stopped in my tracks. I was in a gym and I just looked at the guy next to me and I said, "Who is that?" This is before we had Shazam, before I could figure it out. And he just looked at me and was like, "Oh man, you don't know, it's Maroon 5. And I was just like, this is unbelievable. So tight, so incredible. And I'm guessing that's happened a lot. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your youth, forming the band, the experiences you had. You describe them so beautifully in your memoir, Harder to Breathe.
Yeah, it was a long journey before we became Maroon 5 and had that success finally with the album Songs About Jane. Growing up in LA, we started the band at Brentwood High School. The four original members, Adam, Jesse, Mickey, and I, we used to drive to my house after school on Friday. They'd all sleep over and we'd just spend the whole weekend in my parents' garage. It was 1994 and we were playing grunge music at the time, obsessed with Pearl Jam and Nirvana and Soundgarden. And so it was a different era and it was just the time of our lives. We were kids. We were ridiculously silly and stupid and dreaming of being the next Pearl Jam. And it took us a whole decade of trying and failing and then succeeding and then failing and then trying to come back from it and put it all together to finally have that magic moment that became that album Songs About Jane, which was the culmination of a lot of hard work and a lot of growing up between age 16 and age 24, 25 when we made that record for me. And so I learned a lot in the process and it ended badly for me. I had a breakdown on the road, but as you know from having read the book, that's not where the story ends.
Not at all. And we will certainly be getting into that. And I'm so glad that the story did not end at that. As you pointed out, as it had for so many of your fellow musicians, it seems like a countless number of people ended in horrible catastrophes, including suicide. So glad that you are here and offering your gifts. And now as a therapist, and I'm positive you are going to make a great therapist.
Thank you so much. When we were starting out the band and listening to all those alternative rockers, it was a weird combination of relating to the sort of darkness in those heroes of ours that you're talking about, the Chris Cornells and the Kurt Cobains and Lane Staley of Alice in Chains, and really relating to the dark side that they were really tapping into, but also just the fact that it was cool. These people were like introspective and were not interested in the mainstream consumer culture. And so there was the element of looking up to and sort of emulating them to a certain extent. So it becomes this chicken or the egg thing. It's like, was I a depressed teenager already and relating to them, or did I lean into that space because I thought they were so cool? And it's probably a combination of both. But what occurred to me later on in looking back is that what seemed like a trend in music was really these poor wounded souls that were creating incredible art as therapy for them. And that was probably what sustained them as long as it did. But it was also a mental health crisis that we were really watching unfold in popular culture with these figures that were so fragile and so powerful at the same time. And that's what I loved about them. But realizing how many of them have passed on and how, in relating to them, how much you realize how grateful you have to be for every minute you're here, and for every minute that we had those beautiful souls that gave us all that music.
And I get a little teary-eyed when I imagine someone like a Chris Cornell or Scott Weiland from Stone Temple Pilots, and various others whose lives ended way, way too soon. You were up close and personal with many of your heroes. You mentioned Prince, you mentioned many others who you actually got to hang out with and be up close and in ways that few muggles could ever imagine in their lifetime. And I wonder, just being up and so close and personal and thinking about the chicken and the egg conundrum, if you were to take a guess and maybe alter one variable that might have added to some level of prevention in their trajectories, what might that have been? If you were just to even go out on a limb and take a guess, like what could have constituted like good prevention?
Obviously, with somebody like Kurt Cobain, you have to imagine that if somehow they could have gotten the drugs out of the equation, things might have been different. It's such a dangerous road, and it's almost impossible to really work on your mental health when you're locked in the cycle of addiction, right? I know that was true for me. When I was self-medicating, it's like I was going to therapy and thinking I was working on myself and doing the work, but I was really just spinning my wheels. And my therapist was just kind of biding his time, waiting for me to figure it out that I had to get the alcohol out of the way before I could really work on myself or change anything. So that's a real challenge with anyone who's dealing with addiction. You know, if there's something underneath the addiction that's driving it that you need to get to, but how do you even get to that if you can't get past the substance, right? So that's challenging. But I think that certainly the extent to which we're finally starting to destigmatize asking for help and communicating the things that are challenging us is such a big part of finding solutions. Because, and the things that I was challenged with when I was on the road, there was no conversation about it. It was just that which we did not speak of. And I felt so much, even just the kind of macho stereotype of being a guy in your 20s, like you just grin and bear it, you know, you pretend like there's nothing wrong. You don't share your vulnerabilities with your partners and your male friends. And the reality was that we were all probably emotionally mature enough, even our 20s, to be there for one another and to have those conversations. But it was just so uncomfortable that you just push it down instead of talk about it. And I think that would have been helpful. And I'm sure that for some of my heroes, that would have been helpful as well. If the mental health issues they dealt with were not so stigmatized, that the only place they had to go was into their music to be the tortured artist.
Which can, I imagine, be a reinforcing echo chamber to be the tortured artist. And it's like a one-trick pony. The only thing I've got is this. And it just reinforces what I already am.
Yeah. And there's a romanticization we have with that. The idea that you can't create art unless you're in pain and really just messed up. either with substances or self-loathing. Or I think that there is some truth that creating great art comes from intense emotion, obviously, but I don't think you have to be suffering to that degree to make great art. Quite the contrary, obviously, as we can tell from those people, that the amount of art that they could create was limited because of it. So you hear that story a lot. People that are, I want to be healthy, I want to be happy, but I feel like my art would dry up if I weren't effed up.
Lori Gottlieb has a son named Zach Gottlieb, and on his website, it basically has the motto of, we can't fix what we don't talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And here's a 16-year-old who has already dialed into that super important truth. Destigmatize this. Get rid of the taboo. Let's talk about it. And I've often said, you can talk it out or you can act it out. And unfortunately, many of us just kind of go unconscious and act it out rather than talk it out. And the more talking that we're actually able to do in a real way, I believe, can help take some of the sting out and actually get us ready. We know that through Prochaska's model that there are layers of readiness, or levels of readiness. And you were very beautifully talked about one of your key abilities to kind of intellectualize and rationalize and I'll be fine kind of thing. And that is someplace where a lot of us tend to live, not being ready, intellectualizing, leaning in on various unhealthful coping strategies, but it's all we got at the time, especially when we feel the pressure of like, oh, and by the way, I'm part of a band and I'm needed.
Yeah, I think that I wasn't real good at processing emotions. There was a lot of discomfort inside of me that it was so uncomfortable that I just didn't feel it. I just pushed it down until it was so intense that I couldn't avoid it anymore. And that's toxic, right? It festers inside of you. And there's that deep down feeling of, am I the only one experiencing this? And what's wrong with me? And it becomes that self-loathing because I felt like there was something that was breaking down inside of me and something that was defective inside of me. And the more that I pushed it down, the worse it got. The reality is that if I had processed those feelings, if I were able to communicate them, I'm sure that it would be next to impossible to have a therapist on the road with you unless you're already established act that can carry that kind of expense. But certainly just with the people that are a part of your team, your bandmates, your crew, tour manager. In this day and age, I feel like there's more of a possibility that the whole team can be much more communicative and support one another in ways that we just, especially as men, we didn't share our vulnerabilities in those ways 20 years ago. But it's nice to be a part of the change that I see happening now. And part of the reason why I wrote this book was for that reason. It was just like wanting to be a model of vulnerability and talk about the things that were so challenging for me at the time I was going through them in a way that others could see themselves in it and not have the same problem with processing what's going on for them because they have some models of people that are showing them what vulnerability is and that it doesn't have to be weakness.
Yeah, and that vulnerability is the precursor for courage. We now know that without vulnerability, there's no such thing as courage. If for a really grizzled parachuter, jumping out of a plane is not courageous, but for me to do it would be massively courageous and hugely vulnerable. I'd be white knuckling it the entire way. But as you're speaking, I'm suddenly engaged in like this thought experiment of like, wow, based on your own wounds and the wish and the need to have a therapist on the road with you. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking at you now, coming at me live from your studio with drums and a guitar and the same place from which you wrote your book and provide therapy via teletherapy. You could now be that guy for wounded musicians who need to talk it out rather than act it out.
That's part of what I'd like to do. Absolutely. It's interesting. I've been talking to a lot of people. There's a colleague of mine who has a book out about touring and mental health. And I did a panel with them at the South by Southwest just recently. And it's a book that I wish existed 20 years ago. It's so helpful. And we had a conversation about how I remember when we were going out on the road, the record label had a meeting with us and they talked to us about media training, like how you represent yourself, the kind of things that you talk about in interviews and things you don't talk about in interviews. And it was all, of course, about their marketing. It's about selling records. And if they have the time and the money and the resources to impart that knowledge, I would think that they would then have the same resources to impart. Here's what you need to know about what this life is going to be like. Here are the challenges that are going to present themselves, and here are some strategies for how to work through them. Because being in that position is an inherently unbalanced lifestyle for anyone, even if you're more cut out for it than I was by temperament. Even just one meeting with a therapist, a band meeting with a therapist, to say, look, here are the things that are going to come up for you. Everyone goes through it. These are the ways in which your lifestyle, your self-care, your mind, body, and spirit are going to be taxed by this lifestyle. And here are some strategies to work through it or to prepare for that or to support one another as a team, as a family, in the same way you would do a family session. I think that would have been immensely more helpful and even from a marketing standpoint, more sustainable. You know, if you want an artist to be on the road or cranking out hits for a long time, as opposed to for one hit and then be done because somebody has a breakdown or a drug problem, those kind of strategies could be really helpful to the longevity of an artist's career, which is going to benefit everyone, not just the artist, everyone around, everyone involved with it. The fans, they're going to have more of the music they love. They're going to have more of those experiences. And I just think there's so many ways that we can advocate for one another at this point. And it's only because we've been having these conversations more and we weren't up until relatively recently,
But, you're really speaking about this phenomenon that so many expecting parents engage in. They read something akin to What to Expect When You're Expecting type of book. And I love that idea of having an orientation session with a therapist, what to expect when you're on the road. Mm-hmm. And you address a lot of these things in Harder to Breathe, including the fact that, my gosh, you may be manipulated by external sources like photographers telling you to lose weight. Mm-hmm. And you'll be like, but I'm fine. And it's all the more intense if you're female, is one of the things that you also acknowledge. And I imagine there are so many gleanings that you have that you could offer a person who's about to go on tour for the very first time, or somebody who's been on tour for a long time and has not found a way to cope. And here you could do it without having to be on the bus with them, but you could really do it from your studio and check in on the regular and, of course, preventively before. That would be ideal.
Yeah. I mean, do you remember the movie, the Metallica movie, Some Kind of Monster?
For sure. Amazing.
Of course, that kind of gave band therapists a bad name. I think at one point he was like writing song lyrics and stuff. But if you're at that level and you have a career where there's tens and hundreds of millions of dollars involved, I think everyone's like, yeah, put them in therapy, please. Like, keep them together by any cost. And it certainly can be beneficial at that level for a unit of that stature to have that kind of support. But for every Metallica, there's 1,000,001 other artists out there struggling that don't have those resources and finding ways to support those people. And again, my book is not just about artists. I mean, it is my experience and it is a unique story, I think, in terms of what I went through. But the stuff that I went through are things that you can go through in any industry. I mean, there's the things that people are challenged by, the perfectionism, the imposter syndrome, the anxiety, the stress level, internal stress versus external stress, and how those things compound and can create a situation where you start to break down if you're not taking care of yourself. I think that anyone can relate to those things if they've been in a situation where they've put a lot of pressure on themselves and then they find themselves under a lot of pressure as well. So that's kind of why I wrote the book too, is just that if you see yourself in any of these things, not necessarily the music aspect, there are solutions. There are ways to work through this. It took me a decade because I didn't know any of those things. And I just had to kind of work my way through the whole process of grieving what I lost and all the self-medication I was doing until recovery offered me some solutions and so much more than I could have even anticipated in recovery. But I think the benefit of telling our stories is that if you see yourself even a little bit in that story, then you can find some hope in the person who's gotten through it and hopefully not have to endure some of the same things because there are lessons to be drawn.
Ryan, I'm so glad you brought up the idea that the leanings that you took away from your experience in this truly 1 in a million experience in certain ways. I mean, Maroon 5 is the unicorn experience. This does not happen to everybody, but the phenomena that occurred for you have tons of overlap in other people's lives. And I just immediately was teleported back to when I was 22 years old, a newly graduated guy with a bachelor's degree living in Osaka, Japan. I'd gone from slacker college student to like hardcore worker. And I remember it was kind of a Kafkaesque metamorphosis in my body of needing to suddenly pick up my game and be an adult. And that took a big toll. And one morning, you cannot make this up, I woke up and I couldn't walk.
Oh, wow.
I had somaticized so profoundly the burdens that I felt of being a worker. And I know that was probably an unusual experience. But I would think that anybody transitioning from A to B, whatever the B is, will go through something that may be really uncomfortable and disruptive and may actually be pretty toxic, and just ways of more gently transitioning from that A to B. And by the way, you were a college student yourself. You got a bachelor's degree at UCLA and then went into Maroon 5. I mean, you were in Cars Flowers still, but in the House of Pubes, as you described, which made me laugh so hard. I mean, this is a great book, folks. I mean, in addition to it being incredibly well written and psychological, there are things that will delight you. But it was a massive transition, all of those things. And whether you're aware of it or not, there will be something that transpires that causes anywhere from normal wear and tear to some pretty profound wear and tear on your body and psyche.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all have, as my mom puts it, we all have our stuff, right? That we all have certain baggage we carry with us and that manifests in different ways in our lives. And it can look very different depending on the person. We all compensate for our insecurities and anxieties in different ways, but we all have stuff that we have to work through. And if you haven't worked through it, and then you find yourself in a situation like I did, where you're overcome by the external forces that are challenging you, you're really at a point where you don't have any resources left to really deal with what's going on. And so I think, if anything, the takeaway from my story is that there's nothing wrong with taking care of yourself before you get to that point. There's nothing wrong with admitting, here are the things that challenge me. These are the things that I don't know. These are the ways in which I feel less than, or I feel insecure, or I feel anxious. And so if you're able to work through those things and you're able to treat yourself with kindness, that's really more than anything, is like, don't compound the issue for yourself by making it worse and treating yourself, beating yourself up and telling yourself you're a failure or you're defective in some ways, in the way that I felt. The perfectionism that can be self-defeating. And then the ways in which we think that we're blowing off steam, but we're really just punishing ourselves, right? By putting toxins in our body and not getting enough rest. It's hard, it's hard to be your best self. And the least we can do is to try to be kind to ourselves in the process and not compound the things that are always going to be challenging.
When I hear you speaking about self-kindness or being kind to ourselves, I think about Chris Germer and Kristen Neff, who've really brought into the field of psychotherapy the idea of self-compassion, a thousands-year-old tradition from various Eastern traditions, as well as some Western, but that we seem to have wrongly leaned into an idea that self-flagellation will be virtuous. And instead, it seems to bring out our worst. Almost it's akin to the idea of the tortured artist. Like, the only way you're going to be able to create great art is by being tortured. And we also know that wearing a hair shirt all day is probably not a great idea. So maybe not. And one of the things that Chris Germer out of Harvard said, including on my podcast, if you are a grad student and you want to have publishable results, try to find a good outcome and pair it with self-compassion, because self-compassion leads to so many good things that it's almost a guarantee that you will find that self-compassion will lead to something great.
Mm-hmm. You look at the history of pop culture in our country, and it's kind of ironic that the people that we hold with the highest esteem, the people who have been the biggest icons, and particularly in entertainment, have been tragic figures almost to a person. The Elvis Presleys, the Marilyn Monroes, the Kurt Cobains, the John Belushi, Chris Farley, one after another of these incredible performers that we admire so much, but in some ways we romanticize this deep, deep self-loathing and self-punishment. And it doesn't have to be that way. We don't have to glamorize the extent to which you have to be a tragic figure in order to be special and unique. I think that the tide is shifting in that regard, that we're starting to recognize and admire and look up to people that have self-compassion, that have the ability to find center and balance in their lives and just sort of glow and radiate positive energy and light. Those are the types of people that I look at now and I'm just inspired by. And I'm just so enamored with what it is that they seem to have. And for myself, that happened to me early on in recovery, going to AA meetings. That somebody told me early on, like, look for the one guy in the room that you're like, what did that guy figure out? What does he have that I don't have? And just do what he's doing. This guy, he seems to have everything together. When he talks, it's like he's just, there's just contentment oozing from his pores, and everything he does seems to turn into gold. It's like, just emulate that person, follow him around, listen to the things he says, and try to incorporate that into your recovery program. And that was really helpful for me. And I think we can all do that. That's not to say that we can't admire the Kurt Cobains. Obviously, a tortured soul who makes great art. I will always have a special place in my heart for those incredibly gifted, wounded people. But I think in terms of what we aspire to, I think that lightness and positivity and finding that balance in life is so important.
So beautifully said. And I love so many of these people who have suffered. And yet we know, if you watch Chris Farley's biography, he idealized John Belushi so much that he wanted to live the way Belushi did. And sure enough, he did live and died the way Belushi did. And Chris Farley was one of the greatest human beings who ever lived. And now my kids won't get to see him live like the way I did. And it's so sad. When you saw that guy in the room who was embodying or drinking the water that you wanted to drink, breathing the way you wanted to breathe, what were some of the things that you took in from that person or from those people as role models?
One of the things that I noticed most about what I emulated in early recovery and in some of the people I looked up to was calm energy. So much of my life was about doing and running around thinking I need to have my hair on fire in order to feel like I'm being productive. And what ended up happening with that approach is that I accomplished very little or nothing, just other than feeling stressed and anxious a lot of the time. And then you meet someone who just has this calm, sort of Zen-like approach to living, like letting life come to them, and just very laid back and meditative in their manner. As somebody who had suffered greatly with anxiety disorder for like a decade, I mean, every day was like a walking panic attack every single day. It was just like I had become almost entirely agoraphobic, and I couldn't really do anything without some kind of medication or self-medication to get me through it. The idea that somebody could just sit there calmly and be comfortable in their own skin. And I was like, what? How do you get there? That's what I want to feel more than anything. And, they talked about meditation and about simplifying things, and just some of the wisdom that comes from experience of years in recovery and just having been so humbled by their addictions that just like none of the small stuff seemed that important anymore. Don't sweat the small stuff and try to just look at life from a wider lens than the minutia of the things that get us so stressed out and anxious. 99% of the time, the things that make us anxious are not as bad as we're imagining them, right? There's no lion in the room that's going to kill us. I mean, if there is, then you have every right to be anxious. Go right ahead. But most of the time, it's not that, right? It's something that we've built up in our head to be much larger than it is. So when you can gain that perspective, that's the kind of thing that I've emulated and tried to incorporate. There's a fearlessness that comes with just this sort of very centered and balanced approach to living, that it's not the kind of fearlessness that you think of in terms of like, as you said earlier, jumping out of an airplane and not being afraid, running around with your hair on fire. It's a fearlessness of just being comfortable in the present moment, accepting reality as it is and not needing to run away from it or escape it in some way. I find that.
And coming from you, Ryan, it's all the more meaningful having read your book or listened to your book twice now. It's jaw-dropping that here is a man who played the drums at a world-class level, could sing Highway to Hell to close out the show, knew the lyrics, brought out a guitar. You weren't just a drummer. You could also play the guitar. And I guess Adam would like sit on the drum kit and play the drums while you were singing. It was incredible. But not only did you almost forget how to, we think about automaticity. I always tell my kids, repetition is the mother of mastery. Make sure you repeat. You'd repeated thousands way beyond the 10,000 hours that Malcolm Gladwell talked about with regard to Anders Ericsson's work out of Penn State University. Anxiety is such, we call it amygdala hijack. I mean, the part of the brain in the limbic system that's responsible for anxiety and fear is the amygdala. And it hijacked your ability to perform in those moments. And so if anybody could speak to that, it would have to be you because you've experienced it.
What was profound in terms of what you're describing was that I had played the drums night after night after night. And there was a point at which it was absolute muscle memory. Like I didn't have to think about what I was doing at all. You've played the same song over and over and over again so many times that like I could be having a conversation with somebody else. I could be taking a drink with my left hand while I'm playing with my right hand. And it was almost better if I was distracted in that way because my worst enemy was my brain. And if I was fixated on what I was doing too much, I might fuck myself up because it would become this mental block. It would become sort of obsessive thought that would turn into anxiety, would turn into performance anxiety, even though it was something I'd done a million times. In sports, they call it the yips. There's a term for it for musicians and for athletes that I didn't know even when I was writing the book a couple of years ago. So this is extremely new to me, is the term focal dystonia or musician's dystonia, which is the clinical term for the yips. But in sports, you might see it as a golfer who has putted a million times in their life, and all of a sudden they just have this weird little jerk to the way they putt, and they can't putt straight anymore. Or a pitcher who was at the highest level throwing 98-mile-an-hour fastballs down the middle his whole life and curveballs and sliders, and then all of a sudden they can't just lob the ball over the plate. It's going high, left and right and all over the place. It happens with musicians too. It happens with, it's kind of like a writer's cramp. You see violinists, all of a sudden their fingers get cramped up and they can't play. And for the longest time, I was familiar with this phenomenon when I was a baseball player, the yips. You overthink the throw too much and then you guide it too much. You don't just let it fly and then you end up messing yourself up. And I always related to it as performance anxiety. It's just psyching yourself out. But what I've come to understand in realizing that's what ultimately took me down as a drummer was that it goes beyond psychology at a certain point. It's a trauma response. Basically, something that you've done that many times has become a threat to you. It's tearing you down so much, whether because of the psychological stress or the physical stress, or the fact that for whatever reason, your nervous system has identified this as something that is killing you. And so it's not in your prefrontal cortex. It's not something you can work your way through with cognitive behavioral therapy. It's down in your reptilian brain. It's in your nervous system. In the same way that if you put your hand on a hot stove, you don't have to think about pulling it away. You have a reflex to pull it away, right? It's a survival mechanism. In the same way, picking up drumsticks and trying to play, my brainstem, the central nervous system, started to see that as threat and started pulling away. And so my ability to coordinate playing the drums or to get my limbs to do what they did a million times became very difficult because they were telling me, don't do this. And no matter, and the harder I would try, the worse it would get. So, I mean, I deal with that to this day, and it's really challenging because it's like, how do you overcome something that's wired into your survival? It's something that you can't think your way out of, really. It's like rewiring your reflexes. So that's really what it was. That was the reason, but more than any one joint or any inflammation that was going on or anything really tangible, it was this deeper nervous breakdown that happened.
Sure. And it's such a commonly used term in our lexicon, the idea of a nervous breakdown, even if it's not really a clinical term, but the way you're using the word nervous breakdown is exactly correct. From where I sit, it's a nervous breakdown in the reptilian brain and the brainstem. And one of the things that seems that has helped you have been various ways to really attend to your autonomic nervous system, particularly the parasympathetic, which is our rest and digest, our tend and befriend component of it, through relaxation, I believe in warm water and meditation and other things. What has helped you with your yips, your focal dystonia? What have been the best things to help you be the drummer that you actually are?
I wish I could say that I have the answer to that because I haven't really worked through that completely. That's the one area of my life where I'm still in the middle of my journey in terms of recovery. I'll tell you this much. the way that it affected me in my nervous system became all consuming in the years after I left the band. And that's why medication and self-medication became such a problem, because I was very self-conscious of the shakiness in my hands and the ways in which I used to be very coordinated and then wasn't, and just the anxiety that was social anxiety and became agoraphobia and panic disorder. The only way that I knew how to escape all those feelings and to make it any better, to steady my nerves, was to have enough drinks or to take a benzo or something like that. And that, of course, just made it worse and worse, because now you're training yourself to think that's the only solution, right? Is this chemical solution. It was a state that I was in where at the end, I was basically just anxious, pass out from whatever I was drinking or taking. Anxious, pass out. There was no sense of balance anywhere, just extremes of medicated or anxious. When I was able to get the substances out of the way, that was like 90% of recovery right there, because the ways in which I had been compounding the problem, making it worse for myself by chasing that dragon. Once I was able to get that out of the way, I was able to work on the anxiety and work on all the things you're describing, finding better ways to calm down my nervous system. And there's been a lot of techniques, a lot of things. Some of it was just walking through it, just walking into meetings and being with people, being in a recovery center with other people and showing up and saying, okay, I'm going to be shaking like a leaf and I'm going to have to go talk in front of people and it's going to be terrifying, but I did it. And then afterwards, there was like this great sense of relief. And then the feeling of I accomplished that. And then I have the confidence to do it better the next time. And so there was a natural sort of just walking through the pain and dealing with all those feelings that I'd been pushing away and escaping that empowered me to continue to walk forward into uncomfortable spaces, the discomfort of the things that I was avoiding, and gain the confidence that I can do it. I can sit with it and I can learn from this and grow and actually overcome some of this. And a lot of meditation, a lot of breathing exercises. You mentioned the warm water. That's my go-to. Like if all else fails, if I'm feeling really stressed out and really activated and I just can't seem to work my way out of it, I run a warm bath, I lay in it, and I recite the serenity prayer over and over and over again. And I just think to myself how it applies to me in this moment. What do I need to let go of that I can't control? And what can I control and need to use my resources in a more productive way? And that usually will help me find my center and relax me and find a way to either work through or get past something that's really uncomfortable. But I will say, though, the drums are still my trauma. Music is still my trauma. When I sit at the drums, there's still all that baggage there. And it is difficult to like reestablish that very innocent relationship I had with music and drums. And I'm still working on that. And I'm honest about that just because I'm being honest about everything else. And we're all just exactly where we need to be in our process and our journey. And we can't be any further along than we are. I'd like to believe that at some point I could play the drums the way I once did. It's not a reality yet, but there have been moments when I have felt hopeful and felt like I was making a lot of progress and playing as well as I had in a long time. And then sometimes things come up that trigger old wounds and you have a relapse, and that's part of the process. But in general, the fact that I get up in front of rooms and I give speeches, I talk for an hour. I just came back from a conference in Las Vegas where I spoke in front of a bunch of music educators from around the world. And I spoke for half an hour and then I did a half-hour Q&A. I was the keynote speaker for their conference. And I'm just like, 7 years ago, I was drinking till I passed out on my couch every night, waking up in a pool of sweat, going through the panic attacks daily. And here I am getting up in front of 50 people or whatever it was and just talking into a microphone, just me. And I'm able to do it and I'm able to be myself and to express everything that I've gone through in a way that's helpful to the audience. And it's like, that's just such an empowering thing to be able to do at this point. And it took overcoming so much to be able to do that, that every time I do something like that, I try to remind myself how much I've overcome and how grateful I am to be where I am today. And just also to recognize that anything is possible, even if there are still things that challenge me, even if there are times when I'm like thinking about something I'm going to do and I'm really nervous and my hands are shaking, just realizing I've worked through this before and I'm going to continue to work through it more. And maybe it'll never be perfect. Maybe it'll never be totally gone, but it's going to be a work in progress that I continue to improve and grow. And there's beauty in that. And seeking perfection never got me anywhere anyway. So why should I do it now?
Yeah. And one of the things that I found myself writing down 4 words as you were sharing this really, really hard-earned series of truths. I wrote down coping, exposure, learning, and wisdom. And I'd just like to break them down for you, just what I heard you say. Coping piece, we know that Nietzsche and Kelly Clarkson kind of got it wrong when they said what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. What doesn't kill us may make us a lot weaker. It's how we cope with what doesn't kill us. And you had found coping strategies that caused you nearly to go into states of delirium tremens and near death through just drinking. And that was the coping, and it made you weaker at the time. And then the exposure. Here you mention in the book that you avoided the drums for a long period of time, and now you're kind of immersing yourself back, maybe from an IFS perspective, selves of your various parts this way, but you're allowing yourself to reestablish a relationship with the drums by actually making them proximal and reestablishing that connection rather than avoiding. We know that avoidance increases anxiety, and the more we approach the distressing signal, oftentimes that can go down. And you actually mentioned that beautifully in the book. And learning and the wisdom, my gosh, it's omnipresent. But one of the things that I'm wondering about is the notion of the intrinsic pleasure versus the extrinsic results of playing the drums. And you actually talked about your perfectionism quite a bit in the book, as well as just trying to incur improvement rather than perfection. That improvement is now your North Star rather than perfection. And I was just wondering how all that lands with you, that kind of that reflection that I'm providing now.
Yeah, well, certainly those were the themes. Coping can mean a lot of different things, right? I mean, coping can be a really positive thing or a really negative thing, depending on what you're doing. And if your coping mechanism is an unhealthy one, you're just making it worse, right? Which is what I was doing for a long time with alcohol and other things. But coping now for me is they're more productive pursuits. There are ways to work through and turn something really uncomfortable into an actual learning and growing experience. And coping doesn't just have to be getting through it. It can be actually improving in the process, right? And adding tools to your belt in terms of how you incorporate action to move forward into new spaces that's going to benefit you. Exposure is a big part of it, certainly. I mean, I'm a big proponent. It seems like the simplest form of intervention, exposure therapy, right? You know, just put someone in the place that's uncomfortable and they have to deal with it and get used to it. That was really, for my anxiety, it was probably 90% of what I needed to get through it, was just having to deal with it every day. I had social anxiety, be around people until it's not a big a deal anymore. I mean, there are exceptions to that rule. There are some people that can't tolerate it and they need other tools to be able to.
It can be graded. I mean, you don't want to immediately throw somebody right out into the big waves, but maybe start off in the smaller waves.
Right. I'm speaking in generality.
Totally.
But certainly there was a turning point for me in terms of the exposure where it went from terror and avoiding things that were anxiety inducing, like it was the plague, to all of a sudden recognizing something that made me anxious and having a feeling inside, I want to do that thing because I've gained so much when I've been doing that recently that I know I'm going to gain something. So much so now that I feel like if something makes me anxious, it's almost like a sign that's where you need to be. That's the next thing for you, because there's going to be wisdom to be gained. There's going to be purpose. There's going to be confidence that comes from overcoming that. And, you know, I could not have predicted that becoming an advocate and a speaker beyond writing the book was going to be a big part of my journey as a therapist, because the idea of getting back on stage and doing all that stuff was just very anxiety inducing. But now it's like, wow, it gives me so much pleasure to take on a new challenge and to feel like I'm overcoming it. And I'm not only overcoming it, but feeling like I'm getting good at it. So it's like I see those things, and the more and more I see things that come up, that my first impulse is like to run away from it. And then a second later, I catch myself and I'm like, you know what? If I'm feeling that impulse, that means that that's the thing I need to be walking towards.
Oh, what a great response to that signal. And that's where I think the wisdoms really come in, and your ability to cope well and to just bathe in the serenity prayer. Some of the wisest words in the shortest amount of space ever uttered by anyone ever. In the lexicon these days is FOMO and social comparison. We think about this a lot, and few people have experienced at the level that you have. I mean,
Right.
to be a part of Maroon 5, a household fucking name, and to have built them only to see them after, my favorite album, quite frankly, Songs About Jane, which you were a part of, and then to see that they're continuing without you. What has FOMO and social comparison been like for you from that vantage point? Because it's one thing to be cruising Facebook and seeing how other people are doing. It's another thing to be brothers basically with Adam Levine and see his incredible success as well as your other brothers from the band. What's that been like for you? How have you attended to it?
Well, that was a big challenge, and it took a long time for me to reach a place of peace with that element, because when I went home with my, what we called injuries at the time, I went home to a 1-bedroom apartment with my girlfriend, looking on from afar as my band was still out there on the road playing arenas in Europe and Asia and South America, and really just living the lifestyle that we had been working for a decade to get to. And I felt absolutely like a failure. And I felt like that's supposed to be me, and I blew it. And I'm not able to be there and do that. And so much so that I started going out on the road with them when I was trying to come back from my injury, quote unquote injuries. I would go out on the road with them for stretches and just to be there with them because I wanted to be a part of what was going on. Every time we got another platinum record in Denmark or whatever, I just wanted to be there. I wanted to soak up the success that we had worked so hard to earn. But I was half there because I was externally celebrating the grandeur of what we had accomplished, but internally feeling so defeated and feeling like I'm here, but I'm still missing out. I'm in the middle of this. I'm partying at Prince's house, or I'm at some Grammy party, and everyone is celebrating the record that we made and the Grammy we got nominated for. And I'm still feeling like I'm not a part of this really. And I'm separate from this in some way. And I'm still being left out. This isn't going to be my reality for very long. So it was devastating. And when I did officially leave the band in 2006, the comparison part really became an issue for me because everything that I did paled in comparison to what I had already done. And I don't necessarily even mean just about the success. I mean, obviously, I think if you sell millions of records and win Grammy Awards, it's very hard to repeat that. But it was more just the experience of being in the band with my best friends, starting it from the ground up and creating this incredible thing, going from my parents' garage all the way to the Grammy stage. How could any artistic endeavor compare to that? It was the most magical thing you could imagine. And you don't realize how special something is when you're in the middle of it. I mean, I knew it was special, but I didn't realize how special. I mean, I'm like, that was a collaboration and a synergy between the members of that band, the chemistry that evolved over a decade. That doesn't happen very often. You can't just create that from thin air. It happens magically or it doesn't. And so, not that I wasn't working on things that were enjoyable or fun or inspiring after I left the band and trying to stay involved with music, but it's like, how could anything match up to that experience? And then you look in terms of FOMO and social comparison to the fact that they're still out there having number one hits and arena tours, and I'm making indie records and doing my own thing, and it's like, yeah, well, that should have been me, and here I am doing something different. So of course it was impossible not to compare and to have that feeling of missing out. And I would go to their shows when they were in town. And that was a deeply triggering thing for me for years. Going up there and seeing them play This Love and Harder to Breathe and Sunday Morning, and watching Matt, who's a great guy and I love him and a great drummer, but like he's playing my parts for 20,000 people and I'm in the crowd. And I would drink before I got there because I knew it was going to be rough. And then I would get triggered. And I would drink more, and I'd put on this attitude that I was just enjoying it. I was a rock star. I was having a ball. But by the time the night was over, I'd be back home throwing things around and crying and curled up in the fetal position, like feeling really sorry for myself. And I don't think any of that was going to change while I was still drinking. It wasn't until I quit drinking and I was finally finding some closure, the acceptance element of the grieving process, that I was able to go to a show. And for the first time, I felt nothing but gratitude for the experience of having been in the band and created what we did. And feeling really happy for my buddies, just feeling really great that this thing that we created, they're still doing it and they're still doing it well. And they're even better and greater on stage than we were. They put on an epic show now. I mean, if you haven't seen them live, I really mean this. I'm not just saying this. Like, I just went to their show in Vegas, the opening of their residency. Like, I know they're a pop band and some people don't like pop music, but like when you see them in concert, they're a rock band and they put on an awesome rock show. And I just love it now. I mean, I would be so jealous 10 years ago sitting there and watching them have this epic performance. But now I'm just like, I enjoy it along with everyone else. I have nothing but gratitude and just good feelings for my buddies. And that was something that took a long time, a place that took a long time to get to, and I had to work through some really difficult feelings. I don't know if it was just time or my own recovery, but certainly writing the book too was an element of therapy in that regard, because just going back and having to be meticulous about the whole history and go back to some really difficult places and process them in a sort of narrative therapy, that gave me closure on a lot of stuff. And it allowed me, in putting it into a narrative and recognizing the whole trajectory of the incredibly fun and inspiring feelings early in the band's career up to a point of pain and loss, to come full circle to this place of inspiration in my life again and purpose and fulfillment. I was just able to really fully embody those feelings in terms of my relationship to the band and my history with them, and recognize that, the net of all of that was positive. It was an incredible experience. I wouldn't change it for anything. I wish it had ended differently, but if it hadn't been for that, I wouldn't be doing the things I'm doing today. So it all comes to a place of positivity for me. And putting it out on the page in that way allowed me to achieve this peace and that calm I was talking about earlier, where I'm able to sit in the present moment and just have gratitude.
And I really feel it as you're saying this, Ryan. It doesn't feel like just content spewing from your mouth. I mean, I feel it viscerally as you share this with me and our listeners. And I think that's incredible. One of the things that you're really drilling into is kind of that David Kessler's kind of level 6 of the 6 stages of grief: denial, the anger, the bargaining, the depression, the acceptance being the 5th. And then he's kind of leaned into the idea of finding meaning after the loss. And one of the big things, in addition to writing the book and becoming a therapist as you have, and I'm just so excited, I can't even overstate my excitement that you're entering our field, because I just know that you as a drummer who has such a good sense of timing and so much sensitivity you're going to bring your own thing, and it's going to be amazing. It already is. And the person who was central in the book, who touched my heart more deeply than any of the other starring characters, would have to be Sean. Your relationship provided you, and I imagine still provides you, with healing. Both you and she entered a master's program. She went to USC, you went to Pepperdine. She went into social work. You went into family therapy and psychology. And I'm just wondering if you could describe the healing elements of the relationship itself as it related to your journey.
So Sean entered my life when I was just finishing school at UCLA, when I was about 23 years old. And it was a wonderful time in my life. And it was a relatively positive time in her life. She had finished school and was going to go to grad school to become a social worker, get a master's in social work at that time, and put that on hold because she was caring for her dying father at the time. And after he passed, she was for the first time in a long time just trying to have some fun and be a young lady living her life. That was the time when I met her. She was working at a bar that we were playing at every week. And it was all very romantic and positive. And then we made songs about Jane right after that. And then I went on the road for an eternity, which can challenge any relationship.
So God.
We really had a challenge in front of us in terms of our relationship and everything. And for a few years there, it was difficult, and we broke up and we got back together, and we broke up and we got back together. And then I went through all of the stuff that I went through in my breakdown. And at the time when we were having all this distance between us, and then I came home and it was just weird because I was in a dark place, and then we were living together again. And a lot of this is in the book, but some of it's not, I guess. A relationship that was really put to the test through all of the stuff that I went through. And then I left the band and I went into my depression and grief and alcoholism. And in some ways, our relationship had to go through a lot of different modes, some of which were healthy, some of which were not very healthy, before recovery kind of changed things. And it was just such a wonderful thing to see when I decided to go back to school and go for my master's in clinical psychology. And I told her that. Her response immediately was like, I want to go back to school and get my master's in social work finally. She just was like inspired by where I was at in my recovery, and that dream of hers that she had deferred for a long time, she was inspired to take on. So it felt like the inspiration I was feeling in my recovery was kind of rubbing off on her. And so that was really special. And now I'm a therapist. I'm an associate marriage and family therapist and working in the field. And she's a social worker. She's working at a nonprofit grief support center. She has a lot of, probably even more responsibility than I have at this point. She's a pretty cool position. And it's just like, you couldn't have, when we were going through all the stuff we were going through 10 years ago, you would have not have predicted that we would be where we're at now. So it's wonderful to see both of us finding our purpose again. I'm just really, really grateful for that.
That's amazing. And I hope that wasn't too big of a question for me to ask about how she has been a healing force for you.
It's been a back and forth. We've taken care of each other at different points in our careers, in our lives.
Sure.
And obviously, I was in a place where I needed caring for at one point, and she was definitely somebody who was there for me. There were times in our relationship when she was the one that needed to be cared for, and I was there for her. So there's always been that support system. And now, hopefully, we're both in a place that we don't need to be cared for as much.
So I got to ask you, before I ask my final and miraculous question, just got to ask, Ryan, your favorite Maroon 5 song?
Well, I guess favorite song might be a different answer than favorite track. Maybe. I think that the track that I enjoy listening to most probably is Sunday Morning, just for the reason of that. That was the track on Songs About Jane.
I know it.
That most felt like it's just us playing. I did the drums and then we recorded and then I redid the drums at a certain point because the drums sounded too stiff and they wanted them to breathe more. They wanted it to sound more like a live performance, not like edited. So I just went in there and laid down a live take, and that's what's on the record. And you hear acoustic guitars strumming and tambourines shaking, and it just sounds like us playing. And it's such a breezy, fun, positive song that for all those reasons, it's a warm place in my heart. It just feels like Cars, Flowers, and Maroon 5 put together into this magical just moment where everything was just gelling. I think that This Love is probably the best composition that Adam and Jesse ever wrote. To this day, when I listen to that, I'm like, how the fuck did we come up with that song? Like, it's such a unique composition. And Adam it was really finding his voice as a lyricist, and the track and the production of it was just kind of a no-brainer crossover pop hit. To this day, when I listen to that now, I'm just like, wow, that we really accomplished something with that. So it's kind of a toss-up, but I have a lot of faves. There's some songs that were Cars, Flower songs that to this day, I'm like, that could have been a hit if we had been further along at that point.
Ugh, so great. And you'll find out, by the way, more about Cars, Flowers when you read the book and how they got the name Cars, Flowers, which is really funny. You will not find out how they got the name Maroon 5. That is a sworn secret, apparently, if I'm not mistaken. And I got to just share my two favorites are actually, believe it or not, the title of your book, Harder to Breathe and Must Get Out are my two favorite songs.
Really?
Yes, I think they are bangers. Maroon 5 has never written a bad song, as far as I'm concerned. They are one of these bands that are just amazing. But Songs About Jane, by far my favorite album. It is kind of your Moving Pictures, your Zeppelin 4. It is your Dark Side of the Moon. It is the album with just one, like 10 after another. I mean, every song is incredible.
You know what's funny about that is that it took all of us like a decade to listen to that album and hear it for what it is. Because we were so inside of it when we were making it, and we knew this was our last best chance to have a hit. We had already had a record deal and we had already failed. And so this was our second record deal. We're like, if we don't make it this time, nobody's going to sign us again. This is the last chance. And we were just driving ourselves nuts, pulling our hair out, like in the studio on top of each other, just trying to create something that we were aspiring to all the things you just described. We wanted to make Thriller. We wanted to make an album that was nothing but hit songs, and that every single moment of the album was going to be infectious. If you put the needle down on the record at any point, you're going to be like, oh my God, I have to listen to the rest of this. And that's what we were aspiring to. But while we were making it, we felt like we were failing. We felt like this isn't meeting our expectations. It feels forced. It feels stiff. And then even when we started getting the mixes back, like some of the mixes didn't even come to us until we were on the road. I remember getting the mix for This Love. We was sitting in our van somewhere. It was snowing somewhere in the Midwest. And there's snow coming down, and we're listening to the mix, and we all hated it. We thought it was terrible. We thought it was a mess. And people were talking about the album, and they'd put it on when we were doing like a signing in a record store. They'd put it on, and we'd be like, can you please turn that off? We cannot listen to this. It's terrible. And then like fast forward a decade or more, and I had a conversation with Adam like a couple of years ago where we were reminiscing, and we're like, Jesus, we didn't realize how special that was when we were making it. It's never going to be like that again. It was a magical moment. And when you're so inside of it, sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees. But it was something special, and I'm able to recognize that now. When I listen to it now, I'm like, yeah, it is pretty friggin' good.
Well, actually, just for my own gratification, before my last question, I got to ask, what was it like to play on the stage of Saturday Night Live?
That was a big moment for all of us. I think that even to this day, if you asked Adam and some of the other guys what have been the biggest moments in their career, they might say playing on Saturday Night Live. For a lot of reasons. I mean, for one, it was something we'd watched since we were kids, a show, but every cool music artist, as they were coming up and as they became icons, playing on that stage. And so it was the thing that we had kind of built up in our mind is that's the moment. If you get to play on that stage, like that's when you have made it. And certainly not forgetting that it's live TV. You're playing and you're without a net, live without a net in front of whatever, 10 million people or something like that. And you're doing rehearsals all day. They're blocking for cameras and lighting and sound. And our adrenaline was pumping all day. And I remember I made the mistake. I had like a grande Starbucks for that day. And I was like already nervous and just like my heart was pumping. And we listened back to the recording of the first audio run through. And Adam was like, it's way too fast, man. We got to slow it down. I was like, no. It's got to be fast. And you're sitting in that little dressing room and we're watching the run throughs, and so interesting to see how it all comes together because the whole show is coming together. They've been writing it all week, but they're rewriting it in the hours leading up to the live show, and they're just like doing a dress rehearsal, and it's changing as you're seeing it on your little screen in your dressing room, and that was all very exciting. And then you walk out there, and it was Christina Aguilera was the host, and she's like, "Ladies and gentlemen, Maroon 5." All of her attitude. I don't know. For some reason, it just got real calm. There was stress and energy and anxiety all day. And then all of a sudden it was just, I know we were nervous. If you see the footage, like Adam looks a little more nervous than he did normally on stage, but like, it just kind of went like, whew, here it is. Like we've been working for 10 years to be here and we earned it and we're here. Let's just play it the best we can. And it went great. It was just one of those moments where I'm glad that we felt so present while we were doing it and just realizing what it was and how big a moment it was. And then going to the after party and getting to hang out with all those people. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, that's amazing, dude. And one of the things that seems like it's been so salubrious in your life has been your relationship with gratitude itself. I feel your gratitude for the time that you had rather than any kind of, I'm sure you had to work through all kinds of feels and triggers, but it seems like the one that's dominating now is the gratitude that you have been part of something this huge. And that leads me to my final question, my man. It's magical in a sense. So if you could confer, if you had the magical ability to confer upon all humanity, one skill or one insight that would dramatically improve the existence of individuals and perhaps even society at large, what would that skill or insight be? And what do you imagine the effect would be on the individual and perhaps even society?
Well, I think so much of what I do in my own life and what I do in therapy centers around radical acceptance of the present moment. So much of the problems we have in our life are things that we are imposing on the present. The present is usually not as overwhelming as we make it for ourselves, right? And it can happen because we're dwelling on the past. It can happen because we're tripping about the future. It could happen because we're building things up in the present bigger than they are. And mindfulness is my, sort of approach to meditation, because I tried every other meditation, and having to control my breathing or having to control my thoughts always just made me more anxious. It was this element of radical acceptance of I can't control it. I can just sit in it and accept it. And it's usually not as scary as I think it is. That is such a freeing thing, and was so foreign. It was so foreign to my makeup until I sort of adopted that into my mindset, because I was a control freak. I needed control over everything. I needed to plan things out. I needed to try to mold the present moment into what I wanted it to be, rather than accepting it for what it is. And letting go in that way, just accepting and having gratitude for what is instead of resentment for what is not. That's a big tool that I would suggest for anyone, wherever you are in life, whether you're on top of the world or underneath a heap of stress.
Well, Ryan, I'm so grateful for you sharing your wisdom, your time with me and my listeners, and for having taken the time to write this book. I'm positive it will be a good tool for people who are struggling, but it's also just a really, really delightful read. I mean, it's unputdownable. The best rock and roll memoir I've read since Anthony Kiedis. And so Scar Tissue and Harder to Breathe are going right next door to each other as like my two faves. This has just been a blast hanging with you and really getting into your story.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it, and for all of your kind words.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.